PMP6 exam prep, step by step. This is the 8th day of our course, which is on the PMP 6th edition. And today we'll be covering project scope management. So let's look at where we are. Through this process table that we have been looking at. In our last session, or rather the last two sessions, we did project integration management. And we saw that there are 7 processes. And from that integration management knowledge area, we are today moving into the next knowledge area, which is the scope management. If you look at it closely, you will see that there are 6 processes and 4 of them are in the planning process group. 4 of them are in the planning process group and 2 of them in the monitoring and controlling process group. Let's look at them one by one. Scope management, if we look at an overview and look at what it really means, essentially scope management ensures that all the work required are included and only the work required. Now, if you look at this statement closely, you will see that there are 2 sentences here. One is, we should ensure that all the work that is required are included and only the work required, which also means that we don't want to include anything that is not required. And that is the objective of the scope management knowledge area. We start with plan scope management. And in this process, what we essentially do is we document how scope will be defined. We document how scope will be defined, validated, and controlled. In other words, this plan scope management process is not about drawing the scope, but planning how we will draw the scope. This is the plan. And in fact, when you go through each of the knowledge area, you will find there is a plan. And the plan is about how we go about doing different processes, different activities in that particular knowledge area. Then once we have drawn the plan, we will go about collecting requirements. This collecting requirements is about determining, documenting, managing stakeholder needs. Basically, we talk to different stakeholders, we have many different meetings, and we collect what is it that our stakeholders need. We collect them, we try to understand them, and we document them. Now, once we have these requirements, we have collected requirements, we are now ready to go about defining the scope. Defining the scope is about, we have the requirements that we have collected, talking to different stakeholders. Now we put them together and look at all the different parameters. In fact, in this process, we'll detail out many of the requirements, understand more how we'll go about it, and put together a scope. When we put together a scope, we will now have what is it that we want to deliver, and also what we are not going to deliver. Then, from this scope, we go into creating WBS. Now, WBS, the full form is work breakdown structure. What it really means, we will, from the scope, will break down the scope and break down in terms of smaller deliverables and smaller manageable components that will help us manage the project. if we have it at the scope level, the scope, how we have defined the scope, then we will not be able to take it forward in a way that we can manage the project. So we break it down into pieces, into smaller deliverables, smaller components that will help us move the project forward. Then, once we have done that, and all the execution will take place based on what requirements we have found and what are the work we have identified, and after the execution is done, we go through a validate scope process. Essentially, this is where our users, our stakeholders will actually validate what we have done and formally accept the deliverable. And as we are going through the execution, we will also, or when we are validating the scope and going through the execution, we are going to monitor the status and manage changes. Like we said in the control scope, and when we are talking about monitoring and controlling in the integration management area, we said that we have to have two hats. One is monitoring and controlling. Here as well, we will, in the monitoring and controlling, we will control the scope so that there is no scope creep, as we have discussed in our last session. Now, before we move forward, we need to understand the difference between product scope and project scope. Now, product scope is about features and functions, and it is measured against the product requirements. In other words, let's say we are developing a product. Let's say we are developing a phone, Android phone, for example. And when we are developing an Android phone, then that phone, all the features and functions, how we make the call, and what are the different features, smartphone features, and so on, those are the product scope that will be available to the end user. And when we measure at the end of it, we will measure if this particular feature is available that we have put together in the plan, and so on. As opposed to that, project scope is about the work performed. In developing this product, the phone that we're talking about, what is the work that we'll have to do, and how much effort we have to put in, that is really the project scope. And that is measured against the project management plan. We will draw a plan in terms of when we'll start what, who will do what, and how much will it cost. All these kind of details you will put together in the project management plan, as you've seen earlier, and project scope will be measured by that. So project scope is about the work that will be performed, and product scope is about the features and functions of that product. So these are really the distinct difference that we need to understand. Now let's look at something, how they interplay with each other. Now product scope actually fits into the project scope, or product scope influences the project scope. Because if you have more features, more functions, if you add more features and functions into the product, your scope will increase. And what will the project look like, what will be the project scope look like, will depend on what are the features and functions in the product. And at the same time, the project scope will impact the product scope. For example, if for some reason there are not enough resource and we have, or there is a budget constraint and we have to reduce the project scope because of the budget constraint, then it will impact the product scope. In other words, we might have to take down some of the features and functions to bring down the project scope to so that it meets the budget constraint. And when we do that, the number of features and functions in the product might be sacrificed. So in that sense, it will have an impact on the product scope. Now let's look at each of the processes that we have just seen in the process table. The first one is the plan scope management. As we have said, plan scope management is about drawing a plan, a roadmap, how we will be doing the scoping, how we'll be doing the scope management. The plan scope management is a process, the inputs to which are project charter. Remember, in project charter, we would have put together high-level scope, high-level requirements. And then, of course, the project management plan, environmental factors, organization and process assets, and some of the tools that we'll use are data analysis, meetings, and expert judgment. And the outputs that come out, the two outputs primarily in the plan scope management, one is the scope management plan and one is the requirements management plan. These are the two plan documents that will come out of the plan scope management process. Now, let's look at what each of these documents or each of the output from this particular plan scope management has. So the first output, as you have seen, is a scope management plan. And in the scope management plan, what we'll have is we'll talk about, we'll discuss, we'll put down how will project scope statement be prepared. Because project scope statement will be one of the document that will be prepared. And in fact, we'll see this project scope statement is a component of the scope baseline. And how will that scope statement will be prepared? This is one of this is what we'll look at in the scope management plan. Then how WBS will be created from the scope management. So the process that will follow in creating and enabling WBS work breakdown structure from the scope statement. Then scope baseline, because we said that in the scope management process we'll eventually come to the scope baseline. And so how will, once we get the scope baseline, how will it be approved? And then how will it be maintained? Because even after putting together the scope baseline, after approval, there will be changes that will keep on coming in the scope baseline. And in fact, there are three components in the scope baseline. We'll talk about that, which is one is a scope statement, one is WBS, one is WBS dictionary. And so once we approve the scope baseline, how will we maintain it? As we can expect, there will be changes in there. And finally, how will the formal acceptance of the deliverables be obtained? For example, once we have done the deliverable, what kind of steps will be taken for the user to actually validate the scope, and who will be probably involved, or how they will come about and how they'll measure to see we have delivered, and what are the process probably that will be involved in actually accepting that, because there has to be a formal acceptance of the deliverable, if you remember, before closing the project. Then the next thing was next output to this process is requirements management plan. Now, requirements management plan. Again, we'll talk about how requirements activities will be managed, because we will be collecting requirements, and when we collect the requirements, how will go about it. Maybe we'll be doing a lot of interviews, maybe some workshop, and so on and so forth, and as well as some of the changes that might come. And in the process, there will be different configuration management activities and changes, and so on and so forth. How will that be managed? And when we have these requirements, different requirements, how will we go about prioritizing these requirements? Because that is going to be an important thing, as we'll see later on. We need that requirements prioritization. What is important to the user, to the stakeholder, what is not so important, and what is the process that will follow to prioritize these requirements. And then what kind of metrics will be used to measure, and what is the rationale behind using those metrics, and what will be the traceability structure. We'll talk about this in a little more detail in terms of the traceability, but essentially what it means is we will have a mechanism, a structure to ensure that we are addressing all the requirements at every stage of the project, so that we don't miss out any of the requirements as we move through. Because though it might sound trivial, and why do we really need that, but then what really happens is, in a big project, there are so many moving pieces, there are so many requirements, so many changes that happens, and so many groups keep on working. It is very easy actually to miss some of the requirements as we move through the project, unless we have a structure in place, unless we have a process to place to ensure that we are not missing any requirements. Because that is the last thing that you would like at the end, when you are delivering to the user, and they found when they are testing that, hey, some of the things have not been provided. Now, let's look at some steps that you take. We'll be going through now, moving forward. One is, one of the first steps that we'll take in is collect requirements. We'll take in collect requirements, or basically based on the plan that we have drawn now, we'll go and collect requirements. After the collect requirements, after collecting requirements, we will define the scope. That will be the next process. And then from the scope, we will create WBS. In other words, we'll break down into smaller pieces so that it is more manageable, more controllable, and we'll create that breakdown structure, work breakdown structure. And the lowest level component of the WBS, or work breakdown structure, is what is called work packages. Now, work packages, these work packages, we will use to plan out and execute the project, because we have to deliver the final thing, and we have to address all these work packages as we are going through the execution process. Once that execution is done, or when we are doing the execution of these work packages, or the scope that we have identified and understood, and as we're doing the execution, we will see that the scope is controlled. When you say scope is controlled, we don't want any scope creep, and so on and so forth. And then when we have done through the execution, we will go into validate scope, which is really the user testing or validating what we are providing to them, and accepting the deliverable. So this is the flow that will go through in terms of the scope. Now, let's see how the life cycle, we talked about the life cycle, and how will that impact what we do in terms of scoping. Now, we talked about this spectrum that at one end, we have the predictive life cycle, some projects which are predictive, and at the other end, we have the adaptive. We talked about iterative, we talked about incremental life cycle, and we talked about agile life cycle. And your project might fall anywhere on this line. So how will the scoping that we'll do be different in predictive compared to adaptive? So let's look at that and see what happens. Now, if it is a predictive life cycle, the way we'll move forward is we'll collect the requirements, we define the scope, we create WBS, we validate scope. And so it goes in a sequential process, because we said in predictive, we'll have everything fine, because we have the requirements fixed. We are not worried about the requirements, because we know the requirements and we think there is not going to be any change in the requirements. And of course, during this process, we will control scope, ensure that the scope doesn't get extended, there are no new requirements, no new features that come in. And in this process, though there will be change, as the change comes in, we will take it through integrated change control. Our worry is always that the scope doesn't get extended here, because if the scope gets extended, the time and the cost might get extended. As opposed to that, when we are doing adaptive, as we have said, there is a definite mind shift or mindset shift. Because in the predictive, we generally don't encourage changes unless we have to. Whereas in adaptive, we encourage changes. And our whole process is designed around accepting changes. We feel in agile and this adaptive methodology, we feel that even the stakeholders probably don't have the total clarity what it is that they need. And as we go through that, through iteration, they will understand more, they'll be able to give a clearer viewpoint, and this is how we'll be able to refine what we're doing to what that will really benefit the business. So there is, you can see, a change in the mindset, as we talked about. So what does this really mean in terms of the flow that we're talking about? In adaptive, what will happen is we will get the from the product backlog, we'll take some features for the iteration, and then we'll go through the iteration. In the iteration, we'll create requirements, we'll define scope, and then we'll create WBS. We'll create WBS, we'll go through the execution, and then we'll go through the control scope at the same time and validate scope. So that particular iteration has done, and we have delivered the product to that particular feature we have delivered to our stakeholder. They have validated the scope, they've accepted that deliverable or that particular feature, or those features, that story from the product backlog. Once that is done, we go into the product backlog again and take out the next story that we want to address. Once we do that, we go through the same process again, and so on and so forth. So, in other words, there will be in agile, for example, there will be continuous iteration, and we are taking smaller deliverables every time and at every iteration. So there is, as you can see, a distinct difference between in how we address this during the predictive life cycle as opposed to an adaptive life cycle. So that was the plan scope management. So now let's look at the next process, which is collect requirements. Now in collect requirements, the inputs collect requirements, the inputs are project charter, project management plan, project documents, business documents. Because see here, we are trying to collect requirements. We are trying to collect requirements, and all this will have components of the requirements that we are about to collect. For example, project charter will have high-level requirements. Then project documents will have other project documents have different parts of the requirements. Business documents we talked about will have the business case. We'll have when we see the business document, we will be able to view the requirements from the business perspective. That's really what we want, right? And agreements as well. Yeah, the kind of thing that we do in terms of tools that we use a lot of data gathering tools. We'll use expert judgment, some decision making, and so on and so forth. And we'll look at, discuss a little more on that. And finally, the outputs that we are going to get out from this particular process is, one is the requirements documentation, and another is the traceability metrics. Again, we'll have a closer look at the traceability metrics. Now, let's step back for a moment and think about what comes to our mind when we talk about requirements. When we are about to go and collect requirements, when we say we have to go and collect requirements, what comes to our mind? Very often, it is what really comes to our mind, and in many cases, I've seen the focus is primarily on the main features and functions that product needs. But as we'll discuss here, we will realize that the requirements that we should be collecting is much more than that. And there are different types of requirements that we should think about when collecting requirements. The first is the business requirements. And when we do the business requirements, we try to understand the business objective. What are the different business rules that we should capture and that is important to the business? So, in other words, we try to put a business hat in understanding these requirements. And then there is a stakeholder requirements. The stakeholder requirements is about what are the different stakeholders and how they'll be impacted, and what kind of communication that we will be doing with them, what kind of reporting we'll be doing with them. So what is going to happen is, when we understand different stakeholder requirements, we will understand two things. One is, their different stakeholders will have different requirements based on how they look at and what their preferences are. And when we understand that and we take that into consideration, our engagement with stakeholder will be at a different level. And then we'll talk about solution requirements. And of course, this is where the main focus will be. And when we think of requirements, typically we think about the solution requirements. But even in solution requirements, there are two types of requirements. One is what we say functional requirements. Functional requirements are really the product behavior. We want to provide that, and what are the features and functions that we need to provide. And that, of course, will be the crux that will really decide the final product. But having said that, there in solution requirements, there is another aspect that we should be aware of, which is the non-functional requirements. And what we talk about is environmental condition. Now, let me explain this, because this is something that we should not be overlooking. Let's say your marketing department has come about and said, hey, I want a website to market our product. And you go about talking to the market, collect all the requirements, and put together the website and put together all that needs to be done to navigate through the website, and everything is fine. They come, have a look, and they see you put together beautifully the website, exactly what they wanted. But when they start to click, they realize that it is taking too long. Each page to come about is taking, around a minute or maybe half a minute. And then what you find that though you have put together everything that they've said perfectly, this product is effectively unusable. And unusable because some of the non-functional requirements were not taken into consideration. And oftentimes, unless you explicitly talk about it, these non-functional requirements might not even come in the discussion. So, and this is, for example, here, what should be the speed and how, and this is the kind of requirements that you should look at, saying that how much, within what time should a page gets loaded. So these are the questions that we need to, what is their expectation? Is it 1 second, half a second? So these are what is really the non-functional requirements. So in the solution, we need to take care of functional requirements. We need to take care of non-functional requirements. Then there is this transition requirements. Transition requirements are really the data conversion, the training that is required. And it comes about, and again, this, you are trying to look forward. You are trying to think at this point of time, and when you are collecting requirements, you are trying to think now after we are delivering, what happens? Because after the project is finished, you will probably have to hand it over to the operation. Now, when you hand it over to the operation, what is it that we need to do? These are the really transition requirements. So a lot of times what happens, if there might be some data conversion involved, because you are delivering a product that the stakeholders or operation will use. But it doesn't mean that they have not been doing this function so far. And they might be doing in some other way where they have stored that data. But when you put in the system, they would want to move forward seamlessly. They don't want to lose all the work that they have done before. And so there might be a requirement that you have to take the old data or data in their old system or in the old process and bring them into your product so that they can move forward without any problem, without losing anything that they've done before. So this is a data conversion project. And at the same time, you might also have to provide them training. training in terms of what are the different features and functions, how to navigate through your product, and so on and so forth. So transition requirement is another thing that you need to think about when you are collecting requirements. And then the project requirements. Project requirements is really the acceptance criteria. What will they decide for the success of this project, and what kind of performance they are looking at, and so on and so forth. So you have to look at all these different type of requirements when you are collecting requirements. And of course, quality requirements, where they look at the validation criteria. How will they validate? How will they measure the success or failure of each of the features and functions? Now, in this collect requirements, you will be applying different requirements gathering technique. Now, we'll talk about quite a few here. That this list is not necessarily the exhaustive list. At the same time, you need not use all of these techniques that we'll be talking about. So let's look at them one by one. One is the interview. Interview is a very common requirement gathering technique. And again, when you talk about interview, there are different types of interviews. Interviews can be formal or informal. All interviews need not be formal, that you have to go put together an agenda, go talk through. Some can be just informal. You can have just some interviews over lunch, or when you are having coffee. So something can be informal. Interviews can be one-to-one, and that is typically most of them that you'll find. But that interview can be one-to-many. In other words, you are interviewing more than one person at the same time as you're gathering the requirements. Or interview can be many-to-many, meaning your team might go and interview a group of stakeholders or a business group to gather their understanding, and your team with different expertise will get involved in the discussion. So there can be many-to-many interview as well. And then there are focus groups. Focus group discussions, or that is another way to collect the requirements or gather the requirements. Now, focus groups is about engaging experts. So typically what you do is, when we are going through a focus group discussion, you will focus on certain aspects, and you will bring together the experts from that area. And this has to be moderated. Moderated meaning when you have that kind of discussion, focus group discussion, you have to ensure that everyone in the discussion, different experts, can provide their inputs, can provide their expertise, and it should not be that one person is dominating the whole discussion. Then you will lose out, because you have not collected or gathered input from many of the other experts that you have sought to gather inputs from. Now, focus group discussions, when we have this kind of discussion, it's an interactive discussion. And then, very similar to focus groups, there is facilitated workshop. A facilitated workshop is again a group discussion, but it might not have a particular area to focus on. It might, for example, be about defining product requirements. And you might, when you're defining product requirements, you might get participants from different areas. uh, from different business groups so that everyone can come together and provide you, the input that is required to move through your project. So essentially here, what you're going to do is you'll bring together key stakeholders. You'll identify stakeholders, you will get the key stakeholders and maybe the representative as well, and bring together into a workshop. This helps when you're having such workshops, this helps build relationships as well, because this relationship will be really key as you move forward to the project, because you will be continuously interacting with the user group. Then there are some different group creativity techniques that you will be using. For example, you might be brainstorming and get different groups and have brainstorm ideas. And when you do brainstorming, typically what you do is you don't stop anyone from providing any kind of ideas or whatever ideas that they have. And once you have that, you might go through a nominal group technique to to filter out what are the ideas that is feasible. And in the nominal group technique, you might have a voting approach and put together all the ideas and put some criteria and say, okay, in this criteria, so what do you think, which are the ones that is possible and giving us a maximum benefit. And then through this voting, you try to filter out what are the ones that you can take in to your project. Then there are things like mind mapping, and where you will put together ideas and group them together. Same is affinity diagram. And finally, also multi-criteria Bayesian analysis, where you look at different criteria and different options and see which one works best for you. And we talked about this multi-criteria Bayesian analysis in our previous discussion, and we'll in one of the process downstream, we'll also talk about it in much more details. Then there will be group decision making. Now, group decision making is again something that we touched upon, and we said that a voting, and when we are doing a voting decision making, it can be unanimity where everyone has to agree, majority where more than 50% of the participants have to agree, plurality where we will take in those ideas and the biggest group amongst the participants have agreed. So these are different voting techniques in making a decision making. There is also autocratic or dictatorship approach to decision making, where one person makes the decision, and then we have what is called the questionnaire and surveys. We know this questionnaire and surveys, and we have, it's highly likely many of us have been involved in some way or other in this questionnaire surveys. Now, this questionnaire and surveys approach has the advantage that we can very easily reach out to large number of respondents. Now, if you have to take an interview or have a workshop and things like that, or meeting, it takes a lot of time, and not only time, you'll find that people are not available at the time that you want them to, and so to get the whole thing done, it takes a long time, and it increases exponentially as the number of respondents increase. Whereas in the questionnaire and surveys, you can reach out to large number of respondents very easily. And you can reach out to respondents who are geographically dispersed. For example, someone might be in India, someone is in Germany, someone is in Egypt, or someone is in Canada, you can reach out to any people anywhere through this questionnaire survey. It has the advantage of quick turnaround in the sense that, first of all, it doesn't take a long time to set this up and reach out to them, and people can actually turn back with their responses very quickly at their own time. It also has the advantage of statistical analysis, because what can happen is, depending on the questions that you provide, they can be used for different forms of statistical analysis. And especially because you can have large number of respondents. And as you would know, statistical analysis is possible only when you have a very large number of inputs. Then we have what we call observation techniques. And there are different ways we can go and use this observation technique. Now, observation technique, if you remember, we have also touched upon in the knowledge management. Now, this observation technique is useful for difficult situations. Difficult situations meaning where it is not easy to share the requirements. Maybe because it is not so clear, or there are a lot of insights involved in these requirements, or in some cases maybe the user, whoever is supposed to share with you, is not willing to share that information. In such situation, you can go in for observation. Now, observation is also called shadowing, and there are two forms of shadowing. One is called passive shadowing, where you will go in to observe what they are doing. For example, let's say you are changing or upgrading a finance system, and you want to know what is the kind of process that is involved for different activities that are being done in the finance. So if you're doing a passive shadowing, you will go and sit there the whole day, probably for some days, quite a few days, and observe what people do, what they do, what they do after which activity, and so on and so forth. And you record that, note it down, try to understand as much as possible as you are observing. So that is called passive shadowing. As opposed to passive shadowing, there is something called active shadowing, where you don't just observe, you actually take part. They give you a role to play, and you become a part of that process. And in that, as you are actually being part of the team, you record what is happening through those processes, and what kind of different activities are taken up, are done in what sequence, and so on. So you see, there are two types of shadowing. One is passive shadowing, and one is active shadowing. Then there are these prototypes. Now, prototypes is where you know that you have to build a full thing, but you don't spend time on the full thing. You spend a prototype, a smaller version, which can be changed very easily and modified and tuned very easily without much cost. So prototyping techniques, it allows for experimentation, because it doesn't cost much to in terms of effort and finance. It doesn't cost much to experiment, make changes, and so on. It supports progressive elaboration. Progressive elaboration is about as you move forward, you expand, keep on expanding the requirements as you learn more and more. So that is something that you can do here. And there are different types of prototypes. One is storyboarding. Storyboarding is where you actually put together the story or the flow and help the user, the stakeholder, discover what is it that they really want. And sometimes you might have a prototype which is a small replica of what they want. But then once you have done it, they have accepted, you throw away this and you start with the real thing. As opposed to throw away, there can be functional prototype where you keep on building on that. And you don't throw away what you show. For example, you might have been developing a website, and so you first show the main skeleton, and they say, okay, this is, I like this menu, and then this is the home page I like. So you work on that. And then you move forward, and then you say, okay, this menu or this next page, they say, I like that. So but I need more details, more features and function, and you build on that. And this way, you actually, from the prototype, you keep on growing that to the real product. Then another requirements gathering technique is what is called benchmarking. Benchmarking is where you compare with something else. Maybe you are not able to assess with all the different details that you have, how you want to go about it. And so you go into the benchmarking. So it is comparable analysis. You are comparing with something. And that is what is benchmarking. And it can be a basis for performance measurement. So let me take up an example here to explain what is benchmarking. Now, let's say you have put together, or you are deciding to, your project is about developing a new system. And it is a complex system, and you are trying to figure out what should be the response time. Now, in trying to figure that out, you don't have a realistic estimate. What should it be? Because this is something new that you're doing in the organization, and even the users, they are not aware, or they have not used any such system. So in that case, what you might do, you might look outside some other system that is available in the market, similar system, and see what are typical response time. So you are making a benchmarking, comparable analysis, what it is that you are looking at, and what it is that is when you compare to something that is in the market. And you can use that as the benchmarking. So again, benchmarking can be internal or external. It can be internal in the organization to something else in the organization, or it can be external to the organization as well. Context diagrams is again about using, basically you are diagramming the context. What you are doing is you are really visually depicting the scope. So when you visually depict, a lot of times it becomes much more easier to understand, and even the stakeholders, when they visually see that, they are able to appreciate more, they are able to provide you much more meaningful input. And typically in this, there will be, you will show interaction between systems and actors. So you will see that this system is, this actor is interacting this way. This is the kind of data flow. An example is a data flow diagram, for example. And then, of course, document analysis is again something that you should not ignore. There can be treasures of information in documents that is already available in the organization. And it might be from different angle in technology or if on the business documents. If you look at the business documents different and some articles or something that has been done in the organization, those can provide very valuable information. The whole idea is we don't want to miss out opportunities to capture the requirements. And in document analysis, what we'll see, we'll analyze existing documentation such as business plans, agreements, policies, current process flows. So these are things that we want to see, understand, because at the end of the day, when the stakeholder, the user will look at what you are providing, they are likely to look at and compare against these different kind of documentation and or regulatory documentation, etc., etc. So there are all these different kinds of documents you should look at as you are putting together the requirements. And again, the way you do it is you will not necessarily take all of them. You will take some of them that is appropriate to you, you feel comfortable, appropriate to your project, appropriate in the organization, and use them effectively in gathering the requirements. Now, output that comes about from these requirements documentation is or collect requirements are one is the business requirements that we talked about, which will have business and project objectives, the rules in the organization, business rules, this is important we talked about, and some guiding principles of the organization. Stakeholder requirements. What does stakeholder requirements have? Impacts to other organizational area, because we want to ensure that we are not just addressing our primary stakeholder, but if there are some indirect stakeholder, other areas that gets affected, we should also look at that aspect as well. Impacts to other entities. So not only our organization or our group or the primary group that is sponsoring your project. There might be other entities or other groups within the organization, even external entities that might be impacted. So we need to understand that. The stakeholder communication and reporting requirements, how should we go about communicating with the stakeholders that we have identified, and what are the requirements, reporting requirements? Because remember, they will be different from stakeholder to stakeholder, and we should not think just one report that we send after every week to everyone is really a nice way to communicate, because everyone have their own preferences, and we'll talk about it in more details in the communication module, or communication knowledge area. In solution requirements, we talked about functional and non-functional requirements. We will talk about, we'll try to include technology and what are the different compliance, because a lot of times because of the organization, there might be compliance, so what kind of compliance requirements that will be required when you are doing that, and what support and training, quality requirements, reporting requirements, and so on. Project requirements, as we have talked about, is the level of service we're talking. Then acceptance criteria, what are the criteria that they'll use to accept? And again, we talked about the transition requirements. What we really need, when we are transitioning our project at the end of it to the operations, or if it is in the next phase to the next phase, and so on. If there might be some data conversion, there might be some training that is required, all that we'll put together here. And then finally, when we're collecting requirements, we should put together what we said, a traceability matrix. A traceability matrix is really about putting together a structure to ensure that all the requirements will be addressed at each stage of the project. So, and different stages are like what we're saying: business needs and objectives, project objectives, scope. These are all things that will come in, and then which WBS deliverable will be providing that. What is the product design, product development, test cases, all the different steps or different components, intermediate components that will develop during this particular a project. As you're running this project, as you move through the project from beginning to end, how will they address each of the requirements? Now, if you look at this is what is a traceability matrix. You have the requirements, and then you will, as you move through the project, at each step, you will put down which are the components over there is actually addressing that requirements. For example, you to put a requirements description, and then you first of all put together what this requirements comes out of, what business need or goal objective, so that we know we have put together that these requirements because of a specific need. There is a reason behind it. And what is the project objective? And then when we say WBS deliverables, we put together WBS work breakdown structures, and there will be work packages. And we can say that, well, this particular work package is addressing that requirement. And when we say product design, which part of the product design is addressing this particular requirement? Product development, which part of the product development is addressing this requirement? Test cases, which test cases will actually test this particular requirement? So when we do that, we are really ensuring that all the requirements that we have identified will actually be delivered and will be addressed at each stage of the project. We have finished this collect requirements. Let's move on to the next process, which is the define scope. Though we are a little over time, let me finish this particular process. Now, define scope, when this process have inputs as charter, project charter, management plan, project documents, and EEF and OPA, the kind of tools that we use are judgment, data analysis, many of the common tools that we have been using so far. And what really comes out is, one is the project scope statement and project document updates. Now, I want to specify here something. Project scope statement will be one of the scope, one of the component in the scope baseline. So that is a very important output here from the defined scope process. The question that lurks in many people's mind is, why do we have to define scope? Because we have already collected requirements, right? Why do we really have to go about now defining scope after we have collected the requirements? Now, that's because all requirements that have been identified may not be included in project. Now, when we are collecting requirements, talking to different stakeholders, understanding based on their business, what they need, there is something that we do, if you remember, which is we prioritize. We try to prioritize those requirements. And there is a reason behind it. The reason is, when we are doing that, we are not trying to kind of judge, or we're not saying that, hey, okay, you said this, no, sorry, this is not something that we will do it, because we are not at that position yet. So we want to get all the requirements and then decide what should be within the scope and what should not be within the scope. And that's when and in the defined scope, we actually define boundaries, what will be included and what will be excluded. Now, when we are defining scope, we are taking in these requirements, but there might be many different constraints. And now we look at all these different constraints, and then based on the prioritization that we did, we will say, okay, this part of the requirements can be included in the scope here. And of course, you have to come to an agreement, and you have already done the prioritization. Prioritization will help you in this. What are the ones that you can include? And then you can talk to your stakeholders and say, hey, the next thing that have not been addressed in this particular project can be looked at in the next project or next phase as well. So here we are defining the scope based on the requirements that we have. We draw a boundary and say, these are things that will be included, and this is not what will be included. There will be, and in this process, of course, we'll be detailing out. We'll go through, and in the process of detailing out, we'll go through an iterative process. Maybe they have given something, and then you might even take a prototype to help them understand what they have asked for. And then you can go through an iteration and detail out and say, okay, this is what we will have for you in the final deliverable. And as you do that, you will develop a project scope statement, which, as you have said, will be one of the component in the baseline. The other thing that will come in the scope baseline will be the work breakdown structure, which we'll look at in the next process. And along with that, WBS will be the WBS dictionary. Now, there are some, as we are doing the scope analysis, defining the scope, we will probably go through some product analysis techniques where we define the products and services. And when we're doing these product analysis techniques, we are actually looking at the products and service and decompose that to understand different components, and that will actually help us down the line to actually create the work breakdown structure. And the way we do product analysis technique, again, will be different from application area to application area, as you can imagine. So some of the way that we can do is the product breakdown. You have a product and you break it down into different pieces, and so that will help us understand what are the different components. Sometimes, okay, of course, requirements analysis, system analysis, these are some techniques that we'll be using to actually analyze the products. So system engineering and value analysis, from the value point of view, we look at and analyze and break down and so on. So there are different techniques that is available to do the product analysis. Now, what are the components of a project scope statement? What should we include in the project scope statement? One is the project scope description, deliverable. Then for this deliverable, what are the acceptance criteria? Then what should be excluded? So this is also an important part of the project statement, the scope statement, as it removes the ambiguity in what we will be providing in a final deliverable. Now, we talked about charter, we talked about requirements, we talked about scope statement. Let's see how they are different. They, in some sense, they have a lot of similarity. Probably we might feel why we're repeating them, but then let's compare them side by side, and it will tell us how different they are from each other. And when we talk about charter, we are talking about the purpose, high-level descriptions, right? High-level requirements, summary milestones, stakeholders, approval requirements, authorized personnel. So you see, it is about very high-level information, and one of the main thing about charter is about who is authorized, and who is the authorized project manager, who can approve, and so on. So that was the starting, and that is the purpose of the charter. As opposed to requirements, it is about detailed requirements in each category. So we, from the high level requirements, we go into each area and find out, collect requirements, as much information as possible in each of the categories. Then when you look at the scope, what you do is for each of the requirements, you get into further details of the requirements. Each detailed requirements, you further describe it more. You talk about now what is the actual deliverable based on the requirements. What is it that they'll finally see when they get the thing delivered? So this is what we'll talk about. And how will they decide that they've got the right thing? And what is it that we are excluding from the projects? So you see, they have a similarity, but it is different document, and each has its own purpose. So with this, we have finished this particular process. Tomorrow, on Monday, we'll start with the next processes for the scope from the scope knowledge area. So thank you for being with me today. And